Here's a kind of tutorial on how I fur my Dynamasks. You're going to want to start with your mannequin and your Dynamask and ears and balaclava already attached. Protect your mannequin and then draw your mirror line. This is just like the middle of the Dynamask. I start patterning around the top and side of the head, and then I go around the ears. And then I put this little line here so that I'm able to do the chin more easily, and then you connect it to the side there. Then, once you've got the rest done, you can mark your lines again, and also draw where you want the fur to end. And then you draw your patterns on, make sure you mark your fur direction, and then write down all your colors and whatnot. And it would be a good idea to put darts here if you need. And trace everything, make sure you have one piece original, one piece flipped, and then do this for all of your pieces across all of your colors. Then you're going to sew the ears together and then glue the inside, well, the front of the ear to the front of the ear, and then flip it so that it looks like this. Once you've got your hood sewn, you're going to want to ladder stitch the ears to the hood in the front and the back. And then I scratch up the bottom jaw where the fur connects to it, and then you put a little glue on the tip of the jaw bit there and you hold it down. And then you're able to do the rest of where you've scratched up, and leave this little bit unglued so the jaw is able to move still. You can see how the jaw moves here. Just make sure you don't glue the hinge, just leave a little bit, and then you put a line of glue on the fur backing that is showing, and then you push a little bit of the fur over it. So here's unfinished versus finished, and I just find it looks a lot better on the Dynamask. Some people sew their balaclavas to the neck fur. Personally, I don't. I just think it's a little bit easier and more maneuverable, but that's just personal choice. And once you've got everything sewn and glued, you're done. I've had people in the past ask me how I attach my balaclavas to my Dynamasks, and I figured I'd kind of explain it a little bit. It's pretty simple. Basically, you need a mannequin, you need a balaclava, you need your Dynamask, obviously, and you need elastic. You're also going to need some strips of fabric. I'm using cotton fabric here, but you can use minky, you can use fleece, you can use just about anything that works. And you're also going to need hot glue, obviously, to attach it. I start by removing whatever elastic or straps have come with the Dynamask, and I attach elastic here, or on both sides, so here and here, and then from the top down to the back here. And you're going to want to attach it here at the top where this kind of shape is underneath. I already covered that already, so I'm sorry for that. And you're going to want to make it fit comfortably. You don't want it to be too tight, because when you do fur your Dynamask, it will be tighter on your head. So make sure this fits comfortably and that you can wear it for a long amount of time without it hurting you. Next, you're going to want to cut some strips of fabric, roughly this size. I think this is about 3 or 4 inches by 2 inches, or something similar to that. But basically, you just want strips of fabric like this. And again, you can use any kind of fabric. And starting from the middle, I put a line of glue here and then a piece of fabric, and I glue it to the Dynamask as well, and I glue it over the elastic. And you kind of do the same thing down the side of the Dynamask too. I stop it about here because I found if you put it on the jaw, or if you put these strips of fabric on the jaw, it makes it a lot harder to fur, and it hinders your jaw movement for when you do finish the suit. So essentially, I put a line of glue on the piece of fabric here, and then I stick it to the mask, and then I glue down the rest of this onto the balaclava. And again, you do that from the middle down to about here on both sides. This is something stylistic that I do, but when I get to about this portion, or this on the unfinished side, I like to put my strips kind of diagonally in a way so that it forms a point and it covers that little notch that's in the Dynamask. And that is that's just an aesthetics thing that I do that I think makes them look better. You don't have to do that, but I feel like that adds to the sort of shape of the fur around the Dynamask. So not including the middle piece, I use roughly 5 pieces aside, and I like to cover this bit with this because these diagonally don't really cover it. So I use roughly 5 pieces aside, so cut 11 or 12-ish pieces to cover your Dynamask. This can always be more or less depending on how thick your fabric is, how you cut it, and a bunch of other shit like that. Now, once you've got everything glued on, an optional step you can do is you can glue similar sized strips of fabric down the back, completely covering the elastic and then further securing it to the balaclava. But if you've glued your elastic to the balaclava already, this is not 100% necessary, though if you are going for durability, you could do that. But this area isn't necessarily a high stress area, so it's not completely required. And a sort of step after, when you are going to fur your Dynamask, you're going to want a pattern about, I don't know, a couple millimeters ahead of this fabric, so keep that in mind when securing it to your mask. You want to pattern ahead of it so that you're not seeing any of the show, on the finished suit. And then after that, you're done. Your balaclava should sit how you had it on the mannequin. So when you are adjusting it and putting it on the mannequin, make sure that you have it sitting how you want it to sit on your head when you're finished the suit.
How I make fursuit braids with fox fur. I start with 3 strips of different shades of my main color. Using the exact same color will make it look like a blob. I then violently brush the backing. This will cause the fur to pop out of both sides, making easy double-sided fur. I then stitch the tops together. I used a blanket stitch, since it'll be hidden with a ladder stitch when attached. Now you have 3 hair-like strands. Make sure to ray brush both sides and braid the way you would on regular hair. It will look messy at first. Brush it and gently shave each bubble. Wrap the ends together with strong thread and cover it with your material of choice. Attach with a ladder stitch and done.
Let's talk thread sculpting. People on Twitter really liked my thread sculpted teeth, and I mean really liked, so I thought I'd show you how I made them. I make a pattern like this and draw it out onto my scuba fabric. You could use other fabric with stretch, such as fleece. I include the individual teeth bumps on the pattern, but when I draw them out onto the fabric, I straighten them out like this. Next, I fold the fabric over and pin it, ready for sewing. I machine sew the teeth along the lines. Machine sewing teeth is absolutely one of my favourite parts. Now I carefully cut the teeth out of the fabric, and then I turned it inside out. Next up, I have to stuff them, and I mean stuff them full, real full. Make sure that shit is absolutely compact. I roll the stuffing into little balls with my hands to make sure they're all compacted, and I use a pencil to help me squish everything down. Closing off the top as I go was really helpful too. You want as much stuffing in there as possible, otherwise your sculpting is going to cause wrinkles. Now I'm roughly closing off the top with a blanket stitch. Using a pen, I mark where I want my teeth to go, just along where the blanket stitching is. Now it's the exciting part, the sculpting. I push the needle into one of the markers and pull it all the way through. I then bring the thread over the teeth like a giant whip stitch and push the needle through again on the other side. I then pull it tight until I've got the desired effect and then repeat on the same marker. Make sure you don't pull too tight though, you don't want to snap that thread. I recommend doubling up your thread for some extra strength. Once I've done that, I repeat with the other teeth. With this method, rather than cutting off and tying the thread every time, I just use one continuous piece for the entire thing. That exposed thread at the bottom would be covered up along with the blanket stitch, so it doesn't really matter if it's there. I hope you enjoyed this mini tutorial of sorts. I hope it helps. This is a really useful way of doing teeth. I highly recommend that you give it a go.
Making my first fursuit, part 1, the bucket head. First I measure out 1/2 in foam as long as the circumference of my head plus 3 inches. Then I have to make a couple of markings. And cut. Then it's time to test the fit. Glue together. Had to redo the face markings because I ended up cutting off some of the bone. Making mouth and eye holes on the smaller side to leave room for error. Now I need to make the strips for the top of the bucket head. Blue foam. The smaller strips too. Glue the strips to the cylinder. It ends up like a t-shirt. Is it supposed to look this deranged? I ended up making it a good bit shorter, and now it fits my head perfectly. Side view lol.
Okay, so I'm gonna teach you how to make ears on your fursuit that are really floppy. So first I'm gonna make the weight that goes on the end of the ear. You're gonna want fabric and some scissors and a sewing machine, and then these little poly pellets that are like what they put in Beanie Babies. So you'll trace the end of your ear to get a little pouch, and you'll sew that on your machine, or you can hand sew it actually, and you'll leave a little opening to flip it inside out. After you flip it, you'll be able to put the pallets into this hole, and then I kind of pinch mine closed so that I can sew it. And after you sew it closed, you should have these like little bean bags that are shaped like the top of your ear. And I'm gonna do a part 2 because I didn't know this video was so short. This is part 2 of how to make floppy ears on your fursuit. So when you're doing the actual foam on your ears, you're gonna want to have like your pattern for the full ear, and you will just put foam over what you want to stay up with no foam on the part that flops down. Then when you have your whole ear sewn together with the fur, you'll take your little pouch, which I have a part 1 on my page on how to do this, and sew it to the top of your ear. And then after you have your whole ear sewn together with the pouch in, you can apply glue to the bottom half of the foam part that is attached to your base, and leave the rest unglued, and you will have your floppy ear. Here's how I do the inside of my fursuit ears. That way there is minimal to no wrinkles. So first you're going to want to get the pattern for what you're going to be using for just the minky on the inside of your ears. If there's going to be fur, you don't need that part, you just need the minky part. Then you're going to want to trace your pattern onto minky, and then trace the same pattern onto some adhesive fabric stabilizer. Then what you're going to want to do is put the back of the minky side and the side that gets sticky together, and flip it over, and then use like an iron to iron it on. And after you have your stabilizer on the back, you can then do a very, very light layer of glue behind it, and you are going to have less wrinkles.
I'm a professional fursuit maker, and I've been making suits for 8 years, and I wanted to make a walkthrough of making a suit start to finish. So of course, a great start, I forgot to show the head base, but I do have a pattern for that on my Etsy at Sheenatude. But I cut out 6 pieces of my muzzle pattern. I use 1-inch pieces, so that's 6 inches wide. And then I'm just using a regular box cutter snap blade and carving around the muzzle pieces to kind of get my desired shape. So here you can see I've done half of it already, and I'm just going to go ahead and do the other half now. I also like adding the bridge of the nose before attaching to the head base. It's just personal preference, honestly. But yeah, I go ahead and try to make the other side as symmetrical as I can. Definitely a lot of going back, staring at it, seeing if I like it. And here I'm patterning the nose. I just put duct tape on and kind of draw the shape of the nose out and put a little piece of 1/2-inch foam on it. And then here we go, just gluing it straight onto the head base. So now I'm just going to start patterning the cheeks. I prefer using duct tape, just personal preference. And I do the first layer on 1-inch foam and glue it on by itself, just so I can make sure everything stays symmetrical. And then again, patterning the last 2 layers, 1-inch foam as well. So we got a total of 3 inches on the cheeks. And then after everything is glued, I'm gonna use those box cutter blades and start carving away. I'm constantly going back and forth to make sure everything looks symmetrical on these cheeks, and now we're doing the eyebrows. I've already got my own pattern for the eyebrows, so I just cut those out, smooth them over, and then we're going to do the back of the eyebrows. I just prefer putting an extra piece of foam back there to kind of smooth things out a little bit. And then of course I start measuring how long and wide I want the jaw to be, cut it with 1-inch foam and glue it to the base. Then I go ahead and pattern kind of the jaw around the mouthpiece and glue those on, and then I add a small 1/2-inch bit to kind of help smooth things over. Of course, cut things down with the box cutter blades,
And here I am just really checking on the symmetry. I take it away to check in the mirror. That's a really good way to check your symmetry and kind of carving out any imperfections I see. And I already do have a pattern for the type of ear I want to use, so I just go ahead and cut that out. It's really easy if you just cut out 1 inch from a 1 inch block of foam and cut it in half, then you have 2 perfectly symmetrical ears. So I pin them down, make sure they're in a symmetrical spot, and then I go ahead and glue them on to the head base. Next, I'm just going to use some duct tape and pattern the cheek fluff. Again, just using 1 inch foam and cutting it in half. And now we begin taping. This character is asymmetrical, so you see that I tape the entire nose, but then only the right side of the head. That's just because the only asymmetrical part of the head is the nose, so that part is fully taped. And this is quite a complex head, so I kind of need to see where I'm going. Here I am just roughly tracing out the pattern with a pen first, and then I'll go over it with a marker to kind of get the foresure lines that I want. And I make sure to use different color markers so I can first mark the pattern lines and then where pieces connect, and then once again mark color and fur direction. And there you go, the first part of making a fursuit head is done. I will post part 2 when the fur is done, and I'll show you how to put that on. Welcome back to part 2 of making a fursuit head from start to finish. Today we are furring it. So here I'm just cutting off all of the tape patterns along the pattern lines. This is marking different fur colors and where I want them to go. I just like cutting everything out in one go before doing any of the fur. Here we go, transferring all of the patterns to fur. I won't show everything because it's pretty boring, but always doing one side non-flipped and the other side flipped so that you have both sides of the head. Now that we have everything cut out, it's time to shave. I'm using the Andis AGC 2-speed. Really love these clippers. And if you're shaving fur, please wear a respirator or a really good mask so that you don't breathe in any fur. You can see I'm going over this fur multiple times and going on it sideways. This really helps get a nice smooth shave. And cutting them out, I once again use my box cutter blades, being very careful not to nick myself. And when I do seam allowance, I give very, very little on the head. I'll show you a clip coming up of how much seam allowance I give. There you go. It's not a lot. And also for these face pieces, I'm gonna trim like 1 millimeter of fur from around the edges. As you can see, just the very edge, the fur is trimmed on all the face pieces. Helps get the markings super crisp when you start cleaning everything up near the end. So I also use this fabric stabilizer on some of the face pieces, mainly just on some of the small corners. That way we can keep the markings nice and sharp. And once everything is dried, now we're just going to go ahead and start clipping all the face pieces together to start sewing. I really prefer machine sewing all of my faces, but of course everything I'm doing here you can hand sew. It takes a lot of practice, but I get my seams really short. You can see here how small and close to the edges I get on the machine. Just takes a ton of practice to get that short, but you'll definitely get there with time. You'll see me a couple times after I finish sewing, I kind of trim the seam a little bit more. I just want to get any excess fur out of the way to keep that seam as small as possible so you won't be able to see or feel it when we glue it on. And I also have my brush with me so that I can brush out anything when I'm done sewing, just so I can keep seeing the progress as I go. So now that the face is sewn, I just go ahead and pin it onto the base to make sure I like the fit and everything is looking good. Definitely in the ugly phase, but we'll get through it as with every suit. And now that I'm happy with that fit, I go ahead and start sewing the ears. You'll see when I start sewing the ears together, I only sew the front and back together only like an inch or two from the bottom. That's just because I like to hand sew the top up together once everything is glued on. So once again, put everything back on to check the fit. And when I'm happy with that, then I start pinning on the back of the head. And this character does have hair, so you can see I'm going ahead and cutting out patterns to test it out. And I have very limited amount of fur for this, so I'm using a scrap fur first. Once I like that, I transfer on to the actual fur I'm going to use. This is how I like to do my fur. Just use a slicker brush and brush out the backing on a single piece. Gets it really nice and fluffy and keeps things really light and easy. So I'm going ahead and brushing out every single one of the hair pieces. And once again, I pin them back onto the head to triple check that I like everything. And here is for the bangs. I'm actually sewing a piece of foam into the bangs because I want them to have a specific shape, and you'll see that a little later on. And now that I'm happy with all the fur, I'm actually going to turn the head fur inside out to mark where I want to sew the hair pieces on. So you can see I pin everything back on, and then I take a marker and I mark out where I want these pieces to lay. You can kind of see those lines. So then I take everything off, and I'm just going to first start by sewing the head pieces together, and then I'm going to cut small slits along those lines and put the hair pieces in there and sew it up. So you can see I'm cutting those, putting the hair pieces in, and sewing it closed. And I'm always paranoid about fit, so once again, we're test fitting it. Just to double check, triple check. Once I'm happy with that, I'm moving on to the antenna. This character is a moth-lion hybrid, so this is my first time making moth antenna. So I decided to go for an applique on the middle part of the antenna. So I went ahead and sewn that on, turned it inside out, and then added the second piece now that I saw the guide. And then I'm going to be sewing on a million different little lines for the antenna details, and oh my gosh, cutting all these threads off took a really long time. Didn't even include all the work I had to do with it because it was just an absolute pain. But they look really cute, so it was totally worth it. I forgot to record this other part, but we took the ears off of the head and we are clipping them to the hair. This is how I really like to do my ears. I attach them to the base and then hand sew the rim. And this is just the neck. I attach that to the back of the head as well, and then I will hand sew the front of the neck to the head later on. And once again, flip everything inside out and pin it all back onto the head. And this is really all of the fur work on the head. Now we'll be ready to go onto the lining. Look how beautiful they look. Oh my gosh, I'm in love. Stay tuned for part 3 when we actually do the lining of the inside of the head. Alright, welcome back to part 3 of making a fursuit head start to finish. Today we are lining the inside of the head. So I start by going ahead and cutting open the mouth and eyes. I totally could have done this sooner. I just really hate lining, so that's why this is in part 3 and not in part 1. But yeah, so I go ahead and just use my box cutter and cut out the eye and mouth holes before we start patterning everything. Next, I'm going to use my measuring tape and kind of mark the middle of everything. Since I'm only going to be patterning half of this, I want everything to be as symmetrical as possible. So I'm just trying my best to find the middle points. With the material I'm using, neoprene, it is pretty stretchy, so it doesn't have to be like perfectly down the middle since it has some stretch and give.
Now that I've got that center line drawn out, I'm going to take a bunch of small pieces of duct tape and go ahead and start taping the side of the mouth that I want. Really doesn't matter whatever side you want. But I use a ton of small pieces, especially on the curvier areas, to try and get the best shape fit that I can. Now this part you definitely don't have to do, but I like doing it, especially because I'm using 3D eyes. I pattern the eye holes, so I'll have a little strip of neoprene running through there as well. And now that I've got all the patterning done, I'm just going to mark lines where there's some extra stuff. And right here I also noticed this piece was not laying flat, so just use my scissors, cut it, lay it flat, and then put a piece of tape there to kind of reinforce it. We want everything laying as flat and to the foam as possible. But yep, there's all the lines for where I'm going to cut, and I just mark where I want the teeth and then start cutting all of the tape out of the head. Also being very careful not to cut into the foam too much. Now that I've gotten everything out, I'm just going to remove some extra, get all the pieces to lay flat. And I also completely forgot to mention this in the second part, cutting out the fur. I'm going to show you here how I get my pieces to lay flat. Trying to push everything as flat as possible, and then there I make a cut in the pattern to get it to lay flat. These are called darts. Super important. You're just going to sew these back up after transferring onto fabric. It's to get the best fit. You got to cut you got to cut the pattern to make it lay flat. But yeah, so now that I've got that done, I'm just going to start taping the neck pieces together because I like to line my neck. This isn't needed, this is just my preference. So I just make the neck pieces big so I can just minimize the amount of sewing. Now for the mouth parts, I do use black fleece. So I'm going ahead and patterning the lower and top jaw onto fleece and marking where the teeth marks are. You see the little like 2 marks on the side is where I'm going to put the teeth, so I make everything symmetrical there. And I don't know why I use duct tape. You can totally just use tape. I'm patterning the tongue right here, making everything symmetrical, checking it with the base, see if I want to make it smaller. Then I'm using minky fabric, making sure to check the direction you want it. Then I just have this little extra piece of fabric inside the tongue to kind of make it a little more sturdy. And here I am measuring and patterning the teeth, how I want them to be. Again, use whatever material you want. And here I'm using a chalk pencil to cut out in white neoprene, just because I really don't want any marker coming through on the neoprene. I use chalk. And here we go, putting all of the head and neck lining pieces onto, I use charcoal gray neoprene. This is from Big Z fabric, but I have test washed it and it does not bleed, so don't come at me with that. This is safe. So I'm going to start off by sewing the tongue and the teeth. Slowly, like kind of stuffing them as I make the teeth so that they're ready to put into the lining. And I'll show you how I sculpt my teeth a little bit later on, but here I am sewing everything together. And then we're going to start taking the neoprene pieces, sewing everything together. This is pretty much just like sewing the face fur, but with the inside lining. This is also not needed, but I like to have a little patch with my logo on it inside the neck. So I'm just sewing that right here. Okay, so to sculpt the teeth, I measure how long the teeth are. These are 8 centimeters, and I divide that by 6, because that's just the amount of teeth that I want. And then I'm going to put like kind of a whip stitch around the tooth and tighten it. So this is called thread sculpting. So I'm using the thread to pull down on the fabric and make it rounded, so that I'm locking that stitch in place. And then I'm going to do the next tooth. Again, measuring it, pull the thread tight, and then I'll lock it again. And you can see it kind of sculpting. And here is the finished view of the teeth. And now that all the lining is sewn, we're gonna pin it all back in place because you know how much I love test fitting. here is what everything looks like pinned in place, and we are ready to glue. I always start by gluing the eyes, just because I think it helps hold everything in place better. And I just use my eye blinks to kind of hold the glue in place while it's drying, so I don't have to physically hold my hand on it the whole time. And yeah, I just go ahead and glue everything. Also, I'm using pretty thin layers of glue so that I can have my hand over the neoprene and fleece and it not like bleed through the fabric and burn my hand. So just use like a bunch of thin layers of glue. This again will take practice to kind of get good at, but definitely worth it. Here we go, everything is glued. You see how nice it looks. And this is optional. This is how I attach my lining to my neck. So I flip the neck inside out and pin it around the lining, and then I'm going to run it through the machine in just a second. Okay, here we go, running it through the machine. This is why I leave seam allowance around my neck pieces as well as on the neck lining, so I can do this. Then I turn it back inside out, right side out, pin everything again, and I'm gonna run a bigger stitch around this rim just to kind of keep the shape that I want. And I'll show you a second clip of what that looks like afterwards. This is completely optional. This is just the like that I really prefer. Now that that's done, we're just gonna put everything back on the mannequin, and I'm gonna brush out that seam. You see it around the rim of the neck. That's just always gonna happen. So I go ahead and brush it out the best I can. I'm not done with it, I'll come back to it later, but I just wanna get it done a bit more. And now that the lining's glued in place, I'm gonna finally glue those ears on. I take my time, and you can see that's why I like leaving the top of the ear unsewn, so I can get a really good access to the minky to get it as smooth as possible. And I'll hand sew that open seam on the ears later. And that's the lining. Everything there's pretty much done, and we're ready to finish the furring. That'll be in the next part. Thank you for watching. Welcome back to part 4 of making a fursuit head. Today we're finishing it. I'm gonna go ahead and start patterning this nose so I can cut it out and sew it. I like doing my noses 2 different colors, so I'm making the base a darker color. I'm using minky for this nose, but feel free to use whatever kind of fabric you'd like. Going ahead and gluing that first layer on, since it's mainly just there for looks. And then I'm gonna take the second layer and go ahead and sew it, and then cut out the excess and turn it inside out. And I know a lot of makers like to hand sew their noses to the faces. I've started machine sewing, but as you can see, I'm doing lots of measurements to make sure that I make everything as symmetrical as possible and keep it all even. Honestly, machine sewing the nose to the head is the hardest thing that I do with the heads, but it's worth it. I think it looks a lot cleaner than hand sewing, at least my hand sewing. And now that that's done, of course, we're going to pin everything back on to test the fit for one last time, because now we're going to start gluing the face. I like starting at the bridge of the nose and working down the muzzle, then going to the jaw and the cheeks, and then finally the eyebrows the last. Same with the lining. I do lots of thin stripes of glue because I don't want anything to bleed into the fur. You really don't want big clumps of glue sitting right under the fur, especially if it's shaved short, it's gonna show through. And here I am just doing cleanup markings, cleanup shave, getting everything exactly how I want it to be. Some makers like to hand sew the rim of the mouth to the lining. I prefer just gluing a strip of felt around. So I cut out felt, it's about like 1 or 2 centimeters thick, and I'm just gluing it around the rim of the mouth. I think it looks super clean, and yeah, that's just my preference. So good doing that, and then trimming the extra fur. And here we are sewing the top of the ears together. I'm just using a regular ladder stitch. Feel free to look that up, it's super simple. I'm just going ahead and ladder stitching around the entire ear, and I'll show you how I finish this stitch in just a second. So I just lock the stitch a couple times. I think I do it like 2 or 3 times, just to make sure that it's staying in place. And this isn't a high stress area, so I'm not really worried about it coming undone. But once I lock it into place, I'm going to push the needle through the ear and just pull it out at some random point and then just cut the thread so that the thread is stuck inside the ear and it's not just going to poke out, and yeah, so it ends up being really invisible. And here we are, just finishing the other ear, and then I go ahead and hand sew the back of the head to the front of the head and the neck to the face. So basically anything that is not sewn, I go ahead and ladder stitch it all sewn, and then trim some stuff up. And here I am just hand sewing the antenna onto the head. There's a metal wire in them, so I prefer hand sewing it on. And now that that's done, I'm going to take some trimming shears and just kind of shape the neck fluff and the ear tufts a little bit. This is just my preference. I think thinning shears do a really good job at giving it a little extra definition that the foam sculpting just can't always do. And here we go painting the eyes. I always paint the back of the eyes black. It really helps with visibility. And you can see I'm using just a scrap piece of foam to kind of bat the paint on. Really helps to not plug up any of the holes. And if there are holes that get plugged up, then I just poke it through with a needle. And I'll put the brand of mesh that I'm using on the screen now, just in case you like hand painting your own eyes. So once everything is done painting, then we're going to go ahead and attach them to the eye blanks. I use a piece of felt on the very back, so I'll go ahead and glue the mesh to the eye blanks and then glue a piece of felt on the back just because I think it looks clean. Put them in the head, check the fit, and then I just glue around the rim of the eye. It'll keep it totally secure. Patterning the eyeliner and the eyelids, I put clear tape over the eyes and draw out the eyeliner shape that I want. And I'm also making eyelids for this. I use both the eyelids and the eyeliner out of felt, so I'm going ahead and tracing that and cutting everything out. And I use Velcro for my eyelids, so I'm just going ahead and cutting out the Velcro to put on the eyelids and the eyeliner. And here I am just sewing them on. I use the really stiff part of the Velcro on the eyelids so that the soft part of the Velcro goes on the eyeliner, and it actually blends in really well. You really don't notice it. Once all of that is sewn, I'm just trimming away the extra Velcro to give everything a nice clean look. And I'll show you a slowed down clip of how everything looks after it's all trimmed and sewn. Now that that's all done, I'm going to pin the eyeliner on, make sure everything is even. And then while my hot glue gun's heating up, I just go ahead and cut the fur out for the eyelids and glue that on. Now that that's all ready, I go ahead and just hot glue the eyeliner on. I go slow to make sure everything is sticking correctly, and then I just use my scissors and trim up around the eyeliner where I want. Then I go ahead and do one last final shave, just in case. And then I'm going to do a little liner on the edge of the eyelids, and that is done! This was a personal suit for myself, so I am super happy with them. I also made this piercing off screen. It's just 3D printed with a sewn minky feather. So yes, I'm super excited. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I really appreciate you watching my tutorials. I hope you all have a great day. Bye!